Episode 29, The French Revolution Radicalizes, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Welcome back, everyone. Winter break is getting really close at school, which also means finals week is getting really close, and honestly, the French Revolution kind of feels like the historical version of watching a small problem spiral completely out of control. Last episode, we talked about the long-term causes of revolution in the Atlantic world and the American Revolution. Today, we finally move directly into the French Revolution itself.
And specifically, we're looking at how a financial crisis and a reform movement eventually spiraled into political violence, war, and the reign of terror.
This is also where ordinary people become central political actors. Urban crowds, peasants, radical activists, and soldiers all begin shaping events directly. Fear of traitors, invasion, and counter-revolution pushed politics in a much more radical direction.
But the revolution does not begin with people calling for terror or republics. It begins with a monarchy facing a massive financial crisis. Very ironic. France helped weaken Britain overseas, but in doing so, it nearly bankrupted itself. By the late 1780s, the French government was spending about half of its annual budget just paying interest on debt.
Half? And the monarchy struggled to raise new taxes because the nobles and clergy still enjoyed major tax privileges. Why couldn't the king just force them to pay?
Because the French monarchy was powerful but not unlimited. The parliaments, France's high courts dominated by nobles, resisted many royal reforms. They argued they were defending liberty against royal despotism, though in practice they were also defending noble privilege.
And meanwhile, ordinary people were suffering. Bread prices rose sharply after poor harvests. For many working families, bread was the center of everyday survival. Rising bread prices created a major crisis for ordinary people. Urban workers were furious, peasants faced hardship in the countryside, and educated members of the bourgeoisie were increasingly frustrated with the political system.
Bourgeoisie meaning the middle class?
Mostly merchants, professionals, lawyers, and educated urban elites. Many of them had wealth and education, but lacked the political privileges of the nobility.
Eventually, the crisis became so severe that King Louis XVI called the Estates General in 1789. The Estates General had not met since 1614. The Estates General represented France's three estates, or legal social orders. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate represented everyone else.
The third estate represented about 97% of the population.
It became one almost immediately because of voting procedures. Traditionally, each estate received one vote. That meant the clergy and nobility could outvote the third estate 2-1.
Even though the third estate represented almost everybody.
Exactly. Members of the third estate demanded voting by head instead of by estate.
Why was that such a huge issue?
Because it raised a fundamental political question about sovereignty and legitimate political authority in France. When negotiations stalled, representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly in June 1789. That was an openly revolutionary act because the deputies were claiming authority on behalf of the French nation itself rather than the king. Soon afterward, the deputies found their meeting hall locked and moved to an indoor tennis court where they swore the famous tennis court oath.
Basically promising they wouldn't stop their protest until France had a constitution.
Exactly.
Louis XVI understood the situation was serious, but he hesitated constantly, which became one of the defining weaknesses of his reign.
Meanwhile, rumors spread that the king was preparing to use troops against the assembly.
On July 14, 1789, crowds in Paris stormed the Bastille.
Was the Bastille actually important militarily?
Not especially. It was a medieval prison with only a handful of prisoners inside at the time, but symbolically, it represented royal authority and arbitrary power. The crowd was also searching for weapons and gunpowder, and the fall of the Bastille quickly became one of the defining symbols of the revolution.
Did news of the Bastille spread quickly across France?
Very quickly. People across the countryside heard rumors that major changes were happening in Paris, but they often did not know exactly what was true. During the Great Fear in the summer of 1789, rumors spread that nobles were hiring soldiers or bandits to destroy crops and punish peasants for supporting the revolution. Many peasants panicked and began attacking noble estates and feudal records before the rumored attacks could happen.
Why attack records specifically?
Because those documents listed feudal dues and obligations. Destroying them symbolically destroyed feudal privilege itself.
In response, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges in August 1789.
Did the National Assembly actually have the authority to do that?
Technically, that was unclear. The revolution was moving faster than the old political system could really handle. The Assembly increasingly acted as though it represented the sovereignty of the French nation itself.
And many peasants and urban workers supported those actions because they believed the old feudal system was unfair and outdated. Legally, centuries of feudal traditions disappeared very quickly, even if real change took longer.
Later that same month, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which reflected Enlightenment ideas about natural rights, citizenship, equality before the law, and national sovereignty.
Food shortages and economic hardship continued, creating tension between revolutionary ideals and daily reality.
In October 1789, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles because of bread shortages and anger at the monarchy. The crowd eventually forced the royal family to return to Paris.
Why were women so involved in these protests?
Women were often responsible for buying food and feeding families, so rising bread prices affected them directly. Their political activism grew out of daily survival and household responsibility.
During the next 2 years, the Assembly attempted to create a constitutional monarchy.
Meaning the king still existed, but his powers were limited by a constitution.
Exactly. The Assembly also reorganized France administratively and confiscated church lands.
Why did the revolution go after the church?
Revolutionaries believed the wealthy church should serve the nation rather than stand apart from it.
The civil constitution of the clergy required priests to swear loyalty to the state.
That seems like it would upset a lot of Catholics.
It did. Many clergy refused the oath, and religious conflict divided France deeply.
So even before the terror, France was already splitting apart politically and religiously.
The crisis worsened dramatically in 1791 when the royal family attempted to flee France. This event became known as the Flight to Varennes. Louis XVI and his family hoped to escape, but they were recognized and arrested.
For many revolutionaries, this destroyed whatever trust remained in the king.
Because now it looked like he was betraying the revolution.
Exactly.
Foreign monarchs also reacted with alarm. In August 1791, Austria and Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. The declaration threatened intervention if harm came to the king, though it was partly symbolic. Still, many French revolutionaries interpreted it as proof that foreign monarchies planned to destroy the revolution.
Did that accidentally make the revolution more radical?
Yes.
Rumors of invasion, betrayal, and counter-revolution spread constantly through revolutionary political culture.
In 1791, the new French Constitution created a new government called the Legislative Assembly, which replaced the National Assembly. At this point, France was technically a constitutional monarchy operating under a constitutional system.
But politically, the atmosphere had become far more tense and suspicious than it had been in 1789.
Many deputies in the Legislative Assembly were younger and more radical than earlier revolutionary leaders, and many belonged to political clubs like the Jacobin Club that shaped public opinion.
What exactly was the Jacobin Club?
The Jacobin Club was one of the most influential political clubs in revolutionary France. Its members included educated radicals who increasingly believed the revolution could not survive while the monarchy still existed.
And as trust in the king collapsed after the flight to Varennes, republican ideas started becoming much more popular.
At the same time, many revolutionaries believed foreign monarchies were preparing to destroy the revolution. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria.
Why would they choose war right in the middle of a revolution?
Some revolutionaries believed war would unite France behind the revolution and spread revolutionary ideas across Europe. Others believed war would expose enemies of the revolution inside France, especially members of the monarchy who might secretly support foreign intervention.
The war initially went terribly.
Austrian and Prussian armies advanced toward France. Then the Duke of Brunswick issued the Brunswick Manifesto, threatening Paris if harm came to the royal family.
Instead of intimidating revolutionaries, the manifesto convinced many people the king was collaborating with foreign enemies.
So suspicion just keeps escalating.
Exactly. On August 10, 1792, revolutionary crowds attacked the Tuileries Palace. The attack effectively overthrew the monarchy. The Legislative Assembly suspended the king and called for elections based on universal male suffrage.
That's a huge political shift.
Historians often describe this as the beginning of the Second Revolution because the monarchy effectively collapsed.
Soon afterward came the September massacres. Revolutionary crowds feared imprisoned counter-revolutionaries would support foreign invasions or uprisings, and panic pushed many people toward violence.
Hundreds of prisoners were killed.
Did people at the time think this had gone too far?
Yes, even many supporters of the revolution were horrified.
Soon afterward, the National Convention abolished the monarchy entirely and declared France a republic. By early 1793, many revolutionaries had concluded that the monarchy itself could not survive alongside the revolution. Louis XVI was put on trial for treason, found guilty, and executed in January 1793.
Did executing the king make compromise impossible?
More or less. Monarchies across Europe were horrified. France soon faced war against Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and Prussia.
At the same time, revolts broke out inside France.
The revolutionary government felt surrounded, and that atmosphere of crisis pushed the revolution further toward radicalism. Political divisions also intensified within the National Convention. The Girondists were more moderate revolutionaries, while the Mountain represented more radical deputies closely connected with the Parisian crowds.
The radicals also drew support from the sans-culottes, working-class Parisians who pushed for more aggressive revolutionary policies.
Why were they called sans-culottes?
The term referred to working people who wore long trousers instead of elite knee breeches, and it became a symbol of radical politics.
As the crisis worsened in 1793, the convention created the Committee of Public Safety to deal with foreign invasions, internal revolts, economic instability, and fears of counter-revolution. The committee effectively became an emergency executive government with broad powers over the military, law enforcement, and revolutionary policy.
One of its leading figures was Maximilien Robespierre, who believed the revolution could only survive through strict political unity and harsh action against suspected enemies.
Did Robespierre think the terror was necessary?
Yes. Robespierre believed harsh violence could morally defend the revolution. He argued that terror was justified if it protected the Republic from enemies.
Under the Reign of Terror, revolutionary tribunals executed thousands of suspected enemies. The government also introduced price controls and the levée en masse, which drafted huge numbers of citizens into the army and mobilized French society on an unprecedented scale.
Was that one reason France eventually started winning the wars?
Absolutely.
At the same time, some revolutionaries launched campaigns of de-Christianization. De-Christianization also transformed everyday life. Churches closed, religious festivals disappeared, and even the calendar changed as revolutionaries tried to reshape how ordinary people understood time and society.
Were ordinary people comfortable with that?
Often no. Many ordinary French people remained deeply Catholic.
The revolution also revealed contradictions about equality.
Because women helped drive a lot of these events.
Exactly. Women participated actively in demonstrations and politics, yet revolutionary leaders increasingly restricted women's political activity.
In 1793, the convention banned women's political clubs.
So the revolution talks about universal rights but still limits who gets political power.
And that contradiction became very important later in modern history.
By 1794, French military victories improved the overall situation, and some revolutionaries began arguing that the emergency measures of the terror were no longer necessary.
Georges Danton became one of the most important voices, calling for less government control and an end to the executions.
So even revolutionaries were starting to disagree about how extreme the revolution needed to be.
Exactly. Danton believed the revolution had to calm down if France was ever going to stabilize.
Robespierre disagreed. He believed enemies of the revolution still threatened the Republic, and that ending the terror too early would risk destroying everything the revolution had accomplished.
Eventually, members of the convention turned against Robespierre, worried that he had become too powerful.
In July 1794, Robespierre was arrested and executed. Robespierre's execution began the Thermidorian reaction. The terror came to an end, and more conservative leaders regained control.
The government rolled back price controls and suppressed many radical movements associated with the sans-culottes.
Did people feel relieved after Robespierre died?
Many did. France had experienced years of fear, executions, war, shortages, and political instability.
But stability did not immediately return. The Directory government that followed remained weak and unpopular.
Why was stable government still so hard to create?
Because France was politically divided, economically unstable, and exhausted by years of revolution and war.
After years of executions, shortages, and instability, many ordinary French people were exhausted and increasingly wanted stability more than continued radical change.
And that desire for stability would soon open the door for a rising military leader named Napoleon Bonaparte.
Next episode will follow Napoleon's rise from revolutionary general to emperor and explore how he built a massive French empire before ultimately losing control of Europe. Thanks for listening to The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.